Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I'm really thrilled to be here with Katherine Ramsland and Tracy Ullman, not the comedian, to talk about serial killers and the Serial Killer's Apprentice, which, you know, it sounds like a horrific topic, but it's something that we're all fascinated with. So many of us are fascinated about the psychology of it, and we're really going to dig into this book that Katherine and Tracy wrote. But before we get to that, I just want to say thank you to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our programs, and to Tracy and Katherine who allowed us to share this program with other libraries, because when libraries work together, we just make magic, and that's what we did today. So I want to let you know that you can buy signed books by Book Play from Katherine and Tracy from Aesop's Fable, and I'll put a link to that in the chat, as well as in a recap email I'll send you later. So if you don't miss it now, don't worry about it, we'll get it. And if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, and I will moderate them to Katherine and Tracy. And if you're wanting to chat with each other, feel free to use the chat, because that's always fun to kind of have going as well. So as I said, Katherine and Tracy wrote this book, The Serial Killer's Apprentice, and we're going to talk about what it's all about, why, what, how, when, all of it. And but I would love for you, Katherine and Tracy, to tell us a little bit about yourselves. So before we get started with the book, so that we actually know where you're coming from. So I'm going to start with Katherine on that question.
Okay, I'm very happy to be here and to meet all of you and talk about the work. This is my, I think, 72nd book at the time. I teach forensic psychology and behavioral criminology at DeSales University in the graduate program, though I am retired from the undergraduate program at this point. I am primarily a writer and researcher, and my expertise is extreme offenders. I have spent a lot of time talking to serial killers, but what really sets apart this particular book, The Serial Killer's Apprentice, is the conversations I had with Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., who was 15 when he was leveraged into becoming an active participant in a adult predator's serial murders, and did that for a year and a half until he killed the predator, Dean Corll, otherwise known as the Candyman, and ended the spree. But at the same time, that made him eligible for taking all the blame. Pretty much, he and David Brooks were the two apprentices or accomplices to Dean Corll. Henley immediately led police to where the bodies were buried. There were 27 that they found, and another one a few years later. So Henley was instrumental in, I mean, if he had not done that, the police would have never found the bodies. And so there's something about him that makes him very different from all the other offenders I've spoken with, is that he wanted to be a minister, instead became a killer, and has spent the past 50 years in prison for those crimes. But he never wanted to do it. He has a great deal of remorse. He's a very thoughtful, reflective, intelligent man. And as a result, the conversations I had with him were really a level above what I might have had with someone like Dennis Rader, for example, the BTK killer. With him, I spent 5 years writing his book. But the bigger picture for this was really undertaken by my co-author, Tracy Ullman. So I'm going to turn it over to her to describe what her part is and who she is.
So Tracy's coming to us from Ecuador, and so she might have a little noise in the background, but we don't care, because she's here to chat about this book with us. Welcome, Tracy. Oh, now you're muted.
Muted.
Boom. Hey, thanks for being patient with me, and thank you so much for everyone for being here with us. Really appreciate it. And so Katherine Ramsland and I met each other on a production about Dennis Rader. And at the time, I had just finished producing a 6-part series about the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. And although a lot of the work that I've done is about serial killers and kind of true crime, John Wayne Gacy was part of a 10-year investigation that I did where I realized he was part of a much larger political conspiracy, whereby the Chicago Democratic Party really supported him, protected him. And we wanted to get deeper into that to understand more about how that works. And as I was finding out that John Wayne Gacy had accomplices that we've never realized in 50 years for that case, we started to also make parallels to the Dean Corll and Candyman case. And once that came about, then I requested that Elmer Wayne Henley speak with me. And when he did, the thing that drew me so much closer was that he didn't realize he was part of a much larger sex trafficking ring, that he felt as though he was simply aligned with Dean Corll. It was something he fell into, but actually it's much bigger than that. And that to me was the most important part of this story. And so I feel so privileged that Katherine and I were able to bring two parts into the same narrative, whereby we explore the sex trafficking ring, but that we also are able to look at Elmer Wayne Henley as a unique entity, the only serial killer's apprentice to have killed the serial killer.
Wow. So, Katherine, you were saying that you have written 72 books, a lot of them on serial killers. What initially drew you to this story, or why did it take so long to get to this story for you?
That's actually an interesting question, because I had thought about it years ago. When I first started writing a lot, I was writing for the Court TV's website called The Crime Library, and this is the first rendition of Court TV, not what it is today. And I was doing a lot of work, and one of the stories I wrote was about Dean Corll, and I had used an old book, Jack Olson's book called The Man with the Candy, which is kind of the standard. This is what everybody knows about the case. Little did I know that it was a pretty flawed book in many ways. I didn't know at the time, but I wrote about it. And then I saw Wayne being interviewed for a documentary about his artwork. And that must have been around, I don't know, 2003 or 4. I'm not sure when it was, but I thought that I would really like to speak with him. And I had every intention at the time of contacting him, but did not do so. I had a few other reminders, but at the time when we decided, once we had the production done for Dennis Rader and that A&E production, we wanted to look for somebody for a second season or another similar production. And the first name that popped in my head was, I want Wayne Henley. And I did not know that Tracy already knew him and could make the introduction. And because he trusted her, he was able to move right into it. And really, there was no delay in getting right to work. So, and he worked very hard at it. We spent over a year with hours and hours on the phone, really looking into what his experience had been and within the frame of what Tracy had already brought to the table.
Mm-hmm. So where did it start for you, Tracy? What part of the story were you really involved in?
And so basically, it was a natural jump for me to go from the John Wayne Gacy story and have this entirely parallel story. And so basically, my first conversations with Elmer Wayne Henley were, what was it like to be an accomplice? And he really doesn't fall into a traditional accomplice situation. He was a minor. He was manipulated and coerced and threatened by somebody who's twice his age. And so as I'm trying to get my head around this, I'm thinking to myself, wow, he could really use some help understanding, even after 50 years, and he's in his 60s, he could use some help understanding the context of things that he didn't understand. And the other part of that, so that was where Katherine came in. The part of it for me was 4 days after Elmer Wayne Henley is arrested, and he's murdered Dean Corll, there's another man named John David Norman in Dallas who is arrested as a result of another young man who says, I was supposed to be delivered to Dean Corll. I'm scared to death that I'm going to be killed by this sex trafficking ring. And so Dallas police intervene. They arrest John David Norman, and days later he bonds out. and he faces no consequences and goes straight for Chicago. And so this is how we start seeing that the two cases are actually linked. And for me, that was the most important part, because part of our view of John Wayne Gacy as we were doing that research was that it was all over the country. There were various parts of this ring everywhere. And for me, that's frightening, because why would that sex trafficking ring ever go away? So for me, it was very important to let people know today, wow, this was so big. It made so much money. It had such a far reach. You know, how could we make people more aware that these things happen and how they happen? And then the other part that I think Katherine really brought to the story was being able to work with Elmer Wayne Henley to have us get advice from somebody like him who's never spoken. We don't have a prototype for him. And so he laid out with Katherine ways in which people can avoid, succumbing to this type of behavior.
Tracy, I might have missed this, but what is your background? Were you an author? Were you a police officer? Were you what drew you to interviewing serial killers?
And so I basically got into true crime programming because I was a documentary maker. I started off at the BBC in Glasgow. And so as I continued making programming in the United States and I got further and further in, true crime seemed to be a good fit for me. But this was more for me of a sociological experiment. It was more looking at the corruption end of things, not as much interested in serial killers per se. And so that's really, it was just that I was a documentary maker. And I over the 12 years that I did the research for this project, I was driven more than anything because I'm a mother. And I didn't want my own children falling into this trap.
Oh, wow. We should all read this book. So Katherine, I'm going to go back to you and to say, can you just lay out what exactly was going on with Corll and Henley? What was the story to start with? And then we'll go a little bit back into the larger picture.
Well, in 1970, Dean Corll was a predator. He was looking for young boys to take back to his place to torture, rape, and murder. And then he recruited David Brooks to come in. David Brooks was only 12 when he first met Corll. He is from a broken home. Both parents had kind of, shrugged him off. And here we have Dean Corll bringing him in, respecting him, giving him gifts, gave him a car, gave him money, a place to stay. So this is a lost kid, highly vulnerable, whom an adult predator spotted as vulnerable and took in and then turned into an accomplice. Brooks then brought Henley, intended as a victim, and Corll, I think, spotted his ability to mingle with a lot of the boys in the area. And so he then, little by little, recruited Henley into it so that he had these two boys. And people do ask, why would he use these boys as accomplices? Well, it was because an adult like him trying to lure kids into his car was very conspicuous. If he got kids to bring them to his house for parties and whatnot, and then he could look them over and pick the ones he wanted, and then, bind them, torture them, kill them, and have the boys bury them. So just basically what he did, with at least 27, if not more. We think that there definitely are more, but some of them Corll had taken on his own and buried at other places. And we have accounts from both Brooks and Henley that don't match any of the known victims. So we think there certainly were more victims than that. But 27 in 1973, when Corll was finally killed by Henley, that was a high number. It was a record for mass murder in the United States.
And this was really different too, Tracy, if you want to speak to this, is that it was all in one neighborhood. It wasn't like, as you said, with Gacy, like across the country or anything. So what was going on that so many children could go missing in one area and nothing happened?
We had to wonder about that because you've got a 2.5 square mile area in the Houston Heights neighborhood. And you have a boatyard that's being visited over and over again, where they're digging in there and they're placing bodies. And so in my mind, what I figured out in terms of the Gacy scenario, you basically have individuals that had to have known. Gacy's arrested 6 or 7 times before, for felonious sexual assaults. And so when you think about Corll, and I think this is always really interesting when Katherine brings this up, is that you have somebody both in Gacy and in Corll where they're grooming the entire community. And so you have people who look to these individuals and think, oh, wow, you're a part of the Chicago Democratic machine. How wonderful. You were part of a candy company. You're a respected individual in the community who's reaching out to all these boys and helping them. And when you look at that, you think to yourself, he was very good at what he did. And there's a term that Katherine has, murder, where this is an individual who could see who his victims were and went straight for them. It's definitely something that it could happen again. And it's one of these things where I'd do anything I could as somebody who has a handle on mass media to kind of explore this, exploit this, and get people in a position where they understand the dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Let me just explain this concept of the murder, because it's not necessarily about the victims, it's about the partners. They're looking for partners, and we don't really have a language for understanding kind of the liminal world these accomplices live in. If they're compliant accomplices, resistant, unwilling, but not forced, they're still to some extent a type of victim, but certainly not like the victims who were tortured and killed. So we don't really have a language for them. And I coined the idea of murder like a radar or gaydar kind of thing, where they have an instinct, they have an eye for the kind of kid who's highly vulnerable and can be groomed into becoming a partner. Mm-hmm. And that's what really sets this book apart, is you don't have any other discussions about how vulnerable kids are to being drawn into this. And more so today than ever, thanks to social media and the internet and kids having their own phones and whatnot. They're highly vulnerable to these adult predators who are looking to bring in people who can help them with their criminal enterprise. And our last chapter actually goes through some of the things that parents, teachers, and counselors can be watchful of to assist them to see, because these predators groom the entire neighborhood. They groom the family. They groom everybody that's important to the child, so that they can be thought of as completely acceptable, like a Boy Scout leader or something. They can, nobody's looking at what they're actually doing, because they've so effectively thrown out a facade that they're a perfectly harmless adult who just wants to be nice. And in fact, they're not nice, but nobody sees it, because they're very good at figuring out how to blind us to what they're actually doing.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go back to Tracy to ask about this grooming the neighborhood thing that you were just talking about, and Katherine mentioned as well, is that, most serial killers or victims, we think of people that are homeless or people that are very vulnerable in society. But in this situation, especially, they were really just getting kids. And a lot of times we think of the serial killer as somebody who's in power and can then use their power to entice people to them. But Corll wasn't. He was just another guy in the neighborhood. So what was it about the story that got him to 27 at least in terms of victims?
Well, and the bigger part for me that was interesting is that you have Dean Corll killed by Elmer Wayne Henley. Elmer Wayne Henley is convicted and goes to prison, as is David Brooks, his other accomplice. But then you start seeing around the country photographs of the victims in pornographic poses. And that's what really got me, is that this is not just isolated, and you have an individual who's simply in a small portion of Texas This is somebody who obviously had people helping him distribute these photographs. And when you look at that complex of a network, you can only imagine what else is going on for them. And so, yeah, that for me, when you have individuals who can permeate a community, these children either visited with Corll and, had photographs made of them before they died, or they were part of, some form of trafficking during the process before they died. Either way, it takes the story that we used to know about this case, a lone killer, a monster, and it really takes all those nuances and says, no, this was a guy who worked for the electric company. This is an individual who knew other people within, kind of pornographic and child exploitation circles, but we never made those connections before. And so once he's dead, we think this is over, but it's not. And that, I think, is the most important point, is that these are money-making enterprises. These are so when you think about, the New York Times reported there are 45 million unique images of child pornography on the internet. This is where it started.
This is horrifying. Catherine, I want to go back to the psychology of Henley, because you mentioned that he was very unusual in that he killed his groomer. What was it about? You said he was going to go into the church. What was it that made him understand that he was not okay with that?
Well, part of it was that he had brought a girl. He brought two friends with him to party all night, and they passed out, and they woke up, all of them bound, because Corll was angry that he had brought this girl who was kind of a hindrance to Corll actually going after the boy that Henley had brought to the house. So it kind of started there. He was high, he was drunk, not really knowing what to do, but he did manage to talk Corll into releasing him. And because he said, I'll help you, I'll do whatever you want. And then Corll had a gun and a knife, and he laid the gun down, and Henley had the frame of mind. Now, he lived with his mother and grandmother. His father had abandoned the family. He felt very responsible. He had been trained a lot about how you treat girls, so he felt like he really needed to do something to make sure this girl was protected. And so he picked up the gun and told Corll, stop, you can't keep killing my friends. And I think he thought Corll would back off and say, whatever, just let them go. But he didn't. He came at Wayne and said, you won't shoot. And he challenged him. He came right at him. But he had taught Wayne, if you start shooting, you continue to targets down. And Wayne started to shoot and continued till Corll was dead. So it wasn't that and he had thought about, maybe he needs to kill Corll. He'd already thought about this. He had tried getting away several times. He had tried telling some adults he was in trouble, and they just thought he was drunk or crazy or high and pushed him away. So he didn't think he had much of a recourse, and he thought Corll was going to kill him one day. He thought that's how he'd end up. So in a way, I mean, it was certainly declared self-defense, but in a way, it was a planned self-defense, because he had already considered that he or David Brooks really needed to take this guy out, because he wanted a boy a month. I mean, toward the end, it was just a constant stream of boys coming into the house. And Wayne didn't know what to do. He thought about going to the police. He didn't think they'd listen to him. He was worried about this supposed syndicate that Corll was always talking about, that they'd come after him and his family, and he felt caught. And finally, when he did get involved in the kidnapping and torture, murder of a boy, he knew that he had crossed a line, and Corll had used that to leverage him. So it was all a very complicated set of circumstances, but in a way, I think Henley was prepared for it.
But why, and either one of you can answer this, why was it the girl that triggered him? He'd been bringing boys in, whether he thought it was right or not, up until now. But that moment where he was not treating a girl right was not sort of a trigger for him to really stand up for himself.
Well, I think, I mean, girls had come into the parties. It wasn't that Corll didn't never let girls come into his house. They had come in, but he had a specific idea that night that he wanted Wayne to bring the boy to him because he had a hankering for this boy. And Wayne had brought the girl, which was a hindrance to what Corll wanted to do. So he was angry that Wayne seemed to be thwarting him now. And he already had noticed Wayne had tried joining the Navy. He had tried moving away. So he noticed that Wayne was becoming unmanageable. And this was kind of the final straw. You know, he's doing this to thwart me. And I control this boy, and I'm going to make sure he knows it.
So then once he kills Corll, Tracy, what happens then to Henley and David Brooks? And actually, Katherine, you had mentioned earlier that somebody got away with it without any repercussion. I can't remember the name. They were going to come
So
forward.
John David Norman is the one that really was in charge of this sex trafficking ring. This was just kind of an adjunct group of that. And so he went to Chicago after he bonds out of the Dallas jail. And so, you know, when you've got Dean Corll, he's lying on the floor dead. You have Elmer Wayne Henley and his two friends. They call the police. And Elmer Wayne Henley at this point is so far gone and is in such a different space that he ever thought he would be in, that when police get there, he's so relieved. He said, I can live again. That's what's in his initial interview, where he's just been through hell, really. And so he does confess to where the bodies are buried. He does show police. And every time he does this, he thinks, I'm finally helping. Well, ultimately, Elmer Wayne Henley is committed to almost 600 years in prison. He becomes the face of the case, even though he was only 14 when he began his relationship with Dean Corll. And so you have to wonder, is this a construction? Is this something that was basically put on him? David Brooks never says anything. And so with Elmer Wayne Henley kind of leading the way, he becomes public enemy number one, when he's somebody that we could have learned something from, and which is what we're trying to do now. So when you say it is horrifying, I get that this story is terrible. But I think by educating ourselves, instead of digging into the sort of details, but taking the broader spectrum. So what I would ask of Katherine right now is to kind of give the advice that's at the end of the book that really informs people on how to avoid this scenario, because there's a propensity in human behavior, there's a propensity in society for this to not happen again in the same exact way. But as you know, because Katherine covered most of these cases where you did have a serial killer's apprentice, but to have this advice at the end of the book. So if you don't mind talking to that, Katherine.
Yeah, I haven't memorized all 15 points. So the primary one, and the thing that we saw that was so unusual about this particular neighborhood, well, first of all, we haven't really addressed the police response, which was ridiculous. And it was the same in the Gacy case. They just decided any kid who disappeared had to be a runaway, and they dismissed it. That was just the police response. And then they did not do really much to pursue this notion that there was a syndicate and a child trafficking network at all. They did a little, but certainly not what they could have done. So that's part of it. But we warn that if there's an adult male who is hanging with young kids, teenagers, young kids, be careful of this person. If they don't want adults coming with them, if they're taking these kids somewhere, boy or girl, they're taking them somewhere, they're acting like the big brother type, but they don't want adults coming with them, find out who they are. In this case, they did know things about Corll. He did come across as a very genial type, a big brother type, and they were happy to have his help. But one of them had taken the license plate number of a car that the police could have pursued. They did know that David Brooks, who hung out with him all the time, was selling drugs down at the park. There were certain things these parents knew, and had they networked a bit more and shared information, it's very likely they would have identified Corll as a predator, but they didn't. They didn't talk to one another about their suspicions. And I think having those networks, having a sense of safety in these neighborhoods, making sure the police do not brush things off. I think the parents really tried hard. In fact, some of them tried using a private investigator, and the police ran them off. It just absolutely would not have them be part of it. So I think that the things that we talk about in the back of the book, where in the last chapter, where here's what you can look for. Predators will give gifts, especially unsolicited gifts. They'll make phone calls to the child, not to the parents, to the child. They'll be doing things that should be tipping parents to, this is a little weird. Now, we know a lot more now than we did 50 years ago about how they operate. So that's one thing. But they will find their way around it. They will use social media. They will use a facade. They will get the kid to lie and to keep secrets. And so the parents need to talk to their children about secret keeping, that they don't need to keep secrets, that they don't need to cover for somebody. They need to make sure they know who their kids are spending time with, what adults, and don't take for granted that just because someone's a youth minister or a scout leader or a teacher or that they are safe. And that goes for females too, by the way, because we do have examples of female predators on young boys. So the kinds of advice we give are, don't assume, if your instincts are such that you think something doesn't quite look right, pursue it, protect your child, because your child may be leveraged. And the one thing that Wayne talks about right at the end is listen. They might not be able to articulate it well, but if they're coming to get help, you have to listen and you have to give them credibility. So many times parents have been dismissive or turned away. They didn't want to know about it. They didn't believe the child. They didn't think the child was making any sense. And as a result, the child becomes a victim.
No. Wow. I just have a couple more of my own questions before I start asking questions from the audience. And if you guys have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I already have a couple, which I am going to ask in just a second. So I didn't get to tell you this, Katherine, earlier, but my first degree was in social work. And then I became a librarian. So I'm kind of going the opposite of you, because I know you're working as a philosophy teacher. So I'm really curious about the research that you both do, you and Tracy, around talking to these people who tell you these horrific stories. Like, how do you handle synthesizing that so you can go on with your own life? And as you said, Tracy, like, you have children. How do you function after talking to knowing that anybody in the neighborhood could be like a predator?
I think that the bigger issue is understanding what the potential is, looking for signs, using intuition to know when things aren't quite right. I never feel afraid. I only feel as though if I can understand this work and communicate it, then I'm doing something to help another person who might not be able to be in that position. We are going to be making a documentary series about the book. So I'm hoping that we'll widen that circle of conversation and we'll keep the ball rolling so that there is a higher profile for something like this. And people can feel empowered, not to be afraid, but to take control of their lives because they're informed.
Can I just follow up with that to that question to you, Tracy? Is that there just seems to be so much trauma involved in all ways. How do you manage that for so you don't, in the sense that, like, it's not everybody out there that's unsafe. There's a certain kind of person profile.
So for me, the interesting part is that, I had 3 children that were teenagers. My husband died. And I thought, I'm the classic family that would fall into this trap where I can't watch all 3 kids. And I might not be giving them the attention they need. I might not be addressing their trauma. And they might look to another adult who seems to be very kind. And so it isn't everybody that will fall into this. But on the other hand, it could be everybody. And we have to kind of know what's going on around ourselves and to understand that, I think that when we're talking 50 years ago, that's when, we're looking at the Catholic Church and we're thinking every priest is somebody we could rely on safely. And we come to understand there were a lot of kids that were talking about it and nobody was listening to them. And all I'm saying is that I think that part of a parent and child communicating, part of supporting, our future and our children is understanding that this is something that goes on by degree. So not everybody's a serial killer. Not everybody's grooming people to be an apprentice. But on the other hand, we don't want our children communicating with people who might have untoward agendas.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, there was just a news story today about the boarding school where King Charles had gone that did not have any oversight, and there were pedophiles operating there and trafficking operating there at this prestigious British boarding school. So these are not things you're thinking are going to happen, and then they're happening. And I think you have to be, yes, these people are in the minority, of course, but you can't just assume that everybody of a certain position, and in particular a certain level of authority, intends the best for your child. You can't just assume that. You have to get to know them. You have to know what you're dealing with, and be aware that there are people who can put up a convincing facade.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that keeps coming through is this guy was a con man, essentially. He just didn't look like a monster.
They didn't find one single negative thing about him when they interviewed people who knew him. Nobody had a bad thing to say. Nobody.
You always say that, like, the guy that took the gun and killed all those people, like, oh, he's just a quiet guy in the neighborhood,
If people were monsters, if people didn't have charisma, they wouldn't be able to draw these kinds of crowds. These are a lot of people we're talking about. And so the nuances that go along with that, I'm not a serial killer. I'm not a sociopath or a psychopath. You would have to be one to understand sometimes what's going on. So yeah, it is a matter of just saying to yourself, I'm going to evaluate all these people. Can I trust them? And it's not assuming any one thing about them.
So Rebecca asks, which I agree with, it's such a question, is if a killer is very intelligent or charismatic, how do you tell the difference between them being remorseful, as you mentioned about Henley, and just pulling your leg or getting one over on you, or however way you want to put it? Tracy, you started talking with Henley. How did you know he was sincere?
I can never assume anybody's sincere. I think that it's just a matter of, as the years pass by, I've been speaking with him for 4 years. This is an individual that we could have caught in a lie, or we could have been in a situation where he was trying to kind of steer us in a specific direction that kind of cleared him. He wasn't like that at all. He had incredible remorse. It was obvious that he wasn't a sociopath, that he wasn't unfeeling. And I think that it just really takes a lot of time. It takes, because I mean, especially myself and Katherine, we spent years and years interviewing people. And so can we get it wrong? That's a possibility. But I think that in this book, what we tried to do is not put ourselves in a situation where if we were wrong, we would be somehow made fools of later on. We tried to kind of evaluate this so that it would be poignant for people, regardless of what Elmer Wayne Henley said.
Yeah, we had many early morning conversations exactly on this topic. Should we be accepting what he's saying and picking things apart and trying to figure out, because of course he's going to be self-serving. All human beings are self-serving to some extent. He's going to be hiding his own secrets that he may never want to tell anybody, of course. You compare Henley against Dennis Rader, for example, or Ed Kemper, or others I've talked to, and the difference was striking. And some of the early things he said to me were striking. in terms of wanting to accept 100% responsibility. I will never change his mind on that. And I know better because I know a lot more about the teenage brain than he does, about the complicity that happens with these murder kinds of partnerships. So I knew more about them, but I just let him go ahead and, state what he wanted to state. And through the course of months, many hours on the phone talking, he began to be open to some other ideas. But, initially it was, I'm 100% complicit in this. I'm never going to let anyone change my mind on that. And fine, if that's how you want to be. But, that was probably the very first thing he said to me on the phone. Mm-hmm. So yes, that could have been a lie. That could have been a manipulation. I face that every single day when I do this work. The same thing with Dennis Rader. Right now, they're questioning whether he had only the 10 he admitted to. Maybe he's lying. Maybe my book is, going to be thrown out because now we know there's more, or maybe not. We don't know. Mm-hmm. You never know if somebody's telling you the full truth, if they're really remorseful. I mean, you could say the same thing about anybody who you think is normal. How deeply do they really feel that reflection or that remorse or that love? Or how can you know? You know by behavior for the most part. You know by consistency, by a show of integrity. There are things you look for, but as Tracy said, it takes time. And there are very few people who have the kind of time to invest in these kinds of investigations. It takes a long time, years usually.
Mm-hmm. And you and Tracy both have the history of talking to lots and lots of people like this. So you have a better sense, I think, in general about, or at least it sounds like, about being played by somebody in that position.
But I know from all the experts that I know on psychopathy and serial murder and mass murderers, they all know, we all know, you can be fooled by somebody. We all know. And if we ever get to the point where we think we can't, we're in trouble. We're vulnerable.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. So Rebecca has a follow-up question. Have the police changed their thinking about missing children and brushing it off as a runaway? We were talking, this was 50 years ago. I keep forgetting that was 50 years ago, but have things changed in those 50 years? Tracy?
I don't think so. I think that what you have in something like a sex trafficking ring are you have people that are in power, that are utilizing these services. I think that you have individuals that are charismatic and oftentimes want positions of power. So they're seeking out those roles, but they're also seeking to have, agency with whatever they're going to be doing. And so when you talk about corruption, the only way that we can fight that is to be aware that corruption exists, and that power that goes unchecked is power that grows exponentially. And so there's no reason, nobody in the Gacy case in law enforcement was willing to face this. In fact, they pushed back on it as hard as they could. I did not go to Dallas police to try and investigate, other than Katherine and I both read hundreds and hundreds of pages of their reports. And we started seeing the holes, and we started seeing the fudging and the, just lost strands of investigation that should have gone other places, but that suddenly end on a page and you don't know what happened or why. And so I don't think anything's changed, but as people who pay for our police departments, we need to hold people. We need to hold law enforcement accountable. We want to be partners with law enforcement. And part of that is being aware of what they're up to, what their modus operandi is, how they're dealing with situations. I realize it takes time, but sometimes it is worth it.
Yeah. Katherine, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I don't really study police procedure and the police culture that much myself. That I'm more in the psychology end of things. That's kind of a sociological question. But I certainly see the problems we still have with police taking some of these cases seriously, especially certain strata in society. I mean, we just had a serial killer named Sam Little confessed to 93 murders. And basically what he did was picked victims that he knew police would not expend any resources on. They were usually Black women, prostitutes and drug users that, you know, were anonymous to the police, that they would not really do much with. And he specifically picked victims like that because he knew he could get away with it. And he did for decades.
Wow. I guess for me, like that question for you, Catherine, is about the psychology of the police. What is going on the police as a systemic way that things would fall in under the cracks? Because these are boys that are in a probably middle-class neighborhood, you know, not prostitutes, not drug users, not, you know. So what is the psychology there for the police that they just, even that is under the rug, not investigated?
I really, it's beyond my expertise because I do not study police psychology. I study serial killers. So.
And this is an important point, Mina, is that in both cases, the John Wayne Gacy case and the Dean Corll case, you have police making the victims seem as if they're responsible for their own demise. A lot of times you're having portraits made, media interviews given where they are, made to be drug users or prostitutes, or they have something that's out of the ordinary. They're homosexuals. To say that in 1973 was kind of a death wish. You know, nobody wanted to admit to homosexuality during that period of time. And to suddenly come on television and say, we've got a raft of victims and they're all associated with homosexual sex. You have people just losing their minds thinking, you know, this is ungodlike. It made such an impression upon the public during this period of time. You figure you had Richard Nixon in office. You had so many things that were, you know, operating in a very traditional way. And, you know, that made it seem as though somehow these victims had entered into something because of their predilections. And nobody deserves to die that way. When Catherine refers to Sam Little and his victims, none of those people had it coming to them. None of those women did. And so when you think about police making any kind of assumptions, any kind of, you know, press conferences that judge those victims, you have to think, why is this happening? You know, nobody that's been murdered should be responsible for that.
I think that I'm not trying to pick on the police. I'm just trying to, you had said too, like we should be holding them accountable. How can we hold them accountable if we don't know what the thinking is there? Like what are we looking for to make sure that we're doing that? And we don't have to answer that today.
But we need strong leadership. And a lot of times there may not be that leadership in place. We have to evaluate, is that happening? Are the communities being served by people they recognize? You know, community policing generally makes that connection between people on the street.
I think Tracy just...
So she got frozen. But it isn't that we
and
don't
people,
know,
you know,
it's that we're not the experts. There are people who are, and I don't want to speak on their behalf.
Okay, thank you. No, but this is super helpful though. Sophia and Agnes asked, at what point is it safe to tell our children, or when should we start talking to them about dangerous, you know, they're not strangers because they might just be your neighbor.
I don't think there's a specific age cutoff because I think children mature at different levels. And again, I'm not a child psychologist either. Ask me about serial killers. That's what I do. Maybe Tracy can answer that since she has 3 kids.
And so basically my sense of things is you start very young. You let kids know over time in an appropriate fashion, you know, oh, I'd like to speak with that individual you've been speaking with. Anytime I was speaking with a teacher, I let them know, I'd like to know you better. I'd like to know what your relationship is with my child. You know, there were just a lot of different ways that I started. I've got an autistic child, and at one point found him in a compromised situation with another adult. And I immediately intervened because I knew he can't fend for himself, but I can fend for him. And I explained to him afterwards what had happened so that he could understand going forward how he needs to operate. So it is just having those conversations. I found it mystifying when I began this, that people were saying, oh, child sex trafficking, ew, that's gross. And it is. But as a society, if we don't talk about it, it's worse than that.
Mhm.
So that's my concept of it. Yeah. So if you wanted to know, just from my own input, and I'm not an expert, but that's how I see myself operating.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, so Catherine, serial killer story or question.
Okay.
Kenny says, can you speak at all about how pervasive serial killers are in our communities or in our society?
We don't know. I know that people estimate. I've heard high numbers. I've heard low numbers. We don't know. Certainly, there's a serial killer highway project right now where they're looking at the trucker routes and tracing out the many bodies of victims that have been found in these various truck stops and truck routes, and as a result have identified a number of serial killers who are truckers that way. There's actually a book that just came out, I think last week, called Long Haul, which is all about that initiative. That's one of the more accurate of the estimates. There was a time when people were saying anywhere from, I think it was 35 to 50 serial killers are operating at any given time in America. And I know the person who made that up, and he told me he made that up to get funding for their programs. So, but it ended up in all the criminological textbooks as a fact, when I know it was just simply pulled out of the air. How do we estimate? Well, we could try the estimate, and then along comes someone like Sam Little, who was completely under the radar. We knew nothing about him. He was all over the country murdering these women. They weren't connected to one another. So that's a problem. We have great resources at the FBI. They have a VICAP program, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, where they put it all into a database. However, you need the local jurisdictions to put their information into the database for it to be effective. And they don't like doing it because you have to answer a lot of questions and standardize your data, and it's time consuming. So they don't like doing it. So it's underutilized. If it were more utilized, we'd have much more accurate numbers. It's hard to say. It might be about 10 to 15 was the estimate I heard from the FBI recently, serial killers in the whole country. And we have them overseas as well. We have them in other countries. It's not just an American problem. They're in other places. It all depends on the type of police work that's being done and the records that are being kept and how well they're linking cases to a particular offender or a group of offenders. Often countries don't have the resources to do that. So it's a difficult question to answer, frankly.
What is the number? Is there a number that makes somebody a serial killer versus just a murderer?
Two different, look, that's the latest one since 2005. Used to be 3, but the FBI revised that and said at least 2 each on a different occasion.
Okay. How was Sam Little caught?
Sam Little was caught when he made some mistakes in Los Angeles, and they were able to link him to, I think it was 3 murders there. And then he had a bunch of drawings, because he would draw his victims, a bunch of drawings. And this Texas Ranger was talking to someone at VICAP who was running the VICAP program, and they were sure that he had done more, and he had made some noises about doing more. They didn't at that time have any idea how many, but this Texas Ranger went in and started talking to him and bringing in pizza and whatnot, and kind of schmoozing things over and getting him finally to admit to some of them, and then identifying some of them because they had unsolved cases in their jurisdictions that looked like some of the things he was drawing. It's complicated, but essentially it was just he made some mistakes. They traced some victims to him, and once in custody, they began to work him until he confessed.
I just have time for a couple more questions. Rebecca asks, and I have a part of this question too, is how common is it for a serial killer to have an apprentice or partner? And I would like to know, why would they want an apprentice or partner? You just mentioned that Sam got caught because he made mistakes. And, you know, in addition to you making your own mistakes as a serial killer, now you have to trust that somebody else isn't going to make mistakes on your behalf. So why would somebody want to have a partner as a serial killer?
Well, good question. And also, by the way, I have a book called How to Catch a Killer, which is about 30 cases, and Sam Little is one of them. So how do we catch these guys? And I categorize them in a variety of ways. But about 20% of serial killers do work with one or more partners, up to, you know, even 5 people. Sometimes it's because they want somebody else to know what they're doing. They want to strut their stuff, basically. Sometimes it's because they need complicity in order to carry out certain things. That, you know, there are a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're married to their accomplice. They got involved with somebody, and now that person has to come along for the ride. So there are, and we go into this in the book, the different types of accomplices. Some are co-equal, they both want to be doing this. Some are resistant and compliant, but really don't want to be doing it. Some are forced into it. So we talk about some of the different other types of relationships between serial killers and their accomplices. But often it's because they want someone to help them with something, bury the bodies, for example, or give a cover story, or make it seem like they have a normal family life, etc. So they will have different reasons why, but about 20% do work with a partner, and not always all the time. Like Corll sometimes operated alone, sometimes only with Brooks, sometimes with only Henley, sometimes with both of them. So we have those kinds of situations as well. William Bonin, another serial killer from the 70s, had 5 different partners, but at different times.
Oh, man. Tracy, do you have any thought on that?
No, Catherine's definitely the expert. And in fact, I've got to get going. So I apologize. I've got to jump off just a minute or two early here. But I really appreciate you giving us the time to speak. And I'm positive that Katherine can finish answering the rest of the questions anybody might have.
All right. Thank you so much, Tracy. I know you've made a huge effort to be here tonight.
Thank you. Take good care. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So yeah, actually, just a couple more things. Ruth asked, is it harder now for everybody using phones to get away with serial killer murders? Or is it easier for police to catch people because there's more tools to confer on cases? You were just talking about that database.
We do have some forensic innovations that are helping police to catch more killers. Specifically, the DNA genealogical research has been tremendously important, but also the prevalence of CCTV cameras. That is extremely helpful, and all the people with their doorbell cameras and whatnot. It really makes them a lot more visible than they used to be. Can they get away with it still? Of course they can. There was one serial killer in England, Stephen Griffiths, who actually studied. His PhD was all about where are the sex workers and where are the cameras, and he figured out where he could go get his victims because of the research he had done for his PhD. So yes, can they still get away with it? Yes, but can they get away with it in the numbers that we see? Well, aside from someone like Sam Little, it's probably unlikely that they can. However, this trucker study is showing, I mean, because they have their ready-made, you know, torture on wheels, torture room on wheels if they want. They can dump bodies anywhere and be gone. I think the trucker study is probably one of the most important studies we have going right now.
Okay. And that book is coming out, you said it's called Long Haul.
It's already out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll be looking for that. If you don't mind just answering 2 more questions, because this one's such a good one. Why was Henley not tried as a minor?
He was 17 when he killed Corll, and in the state of Texas, 17 is kind of this liminal age between juvenile and adult. And because of the nature of the crimes and the fact that Corll wasn't around to prosecute, I think I think that really made it so that Henley was definitely going to take the heat as an adult. And we have kids, juveniles who commit murder, certainly being prosecuted as young as 16, 15, 14. So that's not that unusual, but I think it's because Texas has a specific sense of a 17-year-old, which is and Henley even tries to figure it out still. How did this happen? I couldn't vote, but I can be prosecuted as an adult. It's the court system.
Yeah. Rebecca asks if I can send people a list of your books. I'll just send your website to everybody after this.
Well, my website is actually only for my novels. It isn't all the books that I've written. I think if you just went on Amazon or something, you'd get the list.
Okay, I'll find you. No worries. And last question. Tracy had mentioned a documentary. Teresa asks, when will your documentary be released? And you know, any particular channel, PBS, anything like that?
Well, that's the first time I've heard a formal announcement about this. So, I know that it's been in the works. They have the option when it's going to actually start filming and then also be available. I couldn't tell you.
Okay, well, we'll keep a lookout for it. Now, just what is up next for you? What can we look forward to from you after this book?
Well, I just did a book with my horse, so that's that was different. Sonny Says, and that's all about Sonny and his farm animals. So that was just fun. And I will probably next take on my own memoir because I have talked to so many murderers and there was a serial killer in my neighborhood when I was a kid. So it kind of starts there. I have had so much involvement even before I got into forensics with killers of some kind or another. And so I may just put myself into the frame of mind of writing my own murder memoir, unless something else comes along, because it could, you never know.
Well, I kind of hope it's not another serial killer because I'd like them to go away, but I understand that it's not up to me.
Well, I could also say that I've written a series of novels about a forensic psychologist who runs an investigation agency. So many of the things that I've been involved with are what she does. So those novels under my name will show you much about what I have done as an investigator. She's a suicidologist, as am I, and many of her investigations involve figuring out staged crimes and crime scenes and things like that.
Is the next book out for that, In the Damaged Path? Is that
that is from last year? The next one is Dead Handed, which will be on August. And that's actually set in Concord, Massachusetts.
Oh, we are gonna have to do a book tour.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for spending your time with us. This is really fascinating. I never even got to ask you, why are we fascinated with serial killers? That will have to be at part 2. But
certainly,
I so appreciate you taking the time and helping us understand what's going on with this particular case and how we can keep ourselves and our children safe.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the audience that came.
Have a good night, everybody, and look out for that book.